Yo. A pastime of mine for some time now, or while I'm working on 4 or 5 hour videos, is listening to music here on YouTube.com. And while I do have my favorites and go-tos that I'll frequently revisit, I'm always on the lookout for new stuff, new genres, music or vibes for while I write and work on these rather arduous projects. And oftentimes, these musical little journeys have taken me into some pretty strange, interesting, but nonetheless inspiring places. And I suppose I won't bury the lead any longer. This eventually leads me down the rabbit hole of what they call core music, be it weirdcore, dreamcore, traumacore, or more nebulous terms than even that, like liminal music, vaporwave music, Fruiger Aero music, and whatever the hell a jungle mix video game music playlist really constitutes. Maybe you know what I mean. You could be just wanting to listen to some video game tunes from perhaps a certain time period or console while you draw or work on something. Or maybe you're looking for a sort of playlist that fits a certain mood or season or atmosphere that you're going for. And before long, you'll find yourself finding hundreds, if not thousands, of these musical playlists and mixtapes made to pair with further and further more specific core aesthetics and ideas. And while at first I was sort of content to just kind of listen to the music and look at the strange photos and atmospheres that these playlists put me in, it did eventually lead me down the further rabbit hole of what exactly constitutes dreamcore from liminal core, breakcore from nostalgia core, etc., etc., which eventually led me to the Aesthetics Wiki, a wiki dedicated to documenting and sort of finding the sources of inspiration or core concepts that make up these different aesthetics, art movements, ideas, or design philosophies, or in some cases, straight up shitpost movements that makes up these odd, calming, or at times rather off-putting and emotionally charged visuals that make up so many of these YouTube mixtapes. So, if you've ever found yourself falling down these similar music and visual landscape minefields, and would like to hear someone break them down for you, and maybe wax poetic about art, music, and other such things, then welcome to episode 1 of Aesthetic Analysis, where false future ideals, the mindscapes both cozy and dark, and the dreams of yesteryear become our new home for just a short while. When thinking of what aesthetic I wanted to open this with, I figured there was no better option than that of Dreamcore. To start, the Aesthetics Wiki defines Dreamcore as, quote, a surreal internet aesthetic that emerged in the late 2010s and early 2020s, focusing on visuals inspired by dreams. Its imagery is often computer-generated or edited to evoke a dreamlike quality, using bright, surreal, or hazy atmosphere to create nostalgia and comfort. While its settings are comprised of liminal spaces, these spaces can be edited to elicit a dreamy look, unquote. Now, before we go any further, I do suppose I should note that many aesthetics and concepts within not just Dreamcore, but many of the artistic movements and ideas of recent time are defined by that one concept: liminal spaces. A liminal space is best described as a place between places. Transitional areas, devoid of life, when there normally is supposed to be. And the Aesthetics Wiki goes on to note, quote, liminal spaces are locations that, due to their function, are transitional in nature, such as hallways, waiting rooms, parking lots, or highway rest stops. Liminal space aesthetics arise from the feelings of eeriness, nostalgia, and apprehension people describe when presented with such places outside of their design context. Most notably, their function as intermediary points between origin and destination. For example, empty stairwells or hospital corridors at night are often considered foreboding and creepy because these places are usually brimming with life, and the absence of people creates an otherworldly and forlorn atmosphere." Unquote. Malls in the early morning, empty parking lots, a school hallway during the summer, an airport terminal with no one there waiting for their next flight, or perhaps even a kid's park late into the night. These are all examples of liminal spaces, and this concept will be coming up a lot during the series. And in many ways, it's kind of an aesthetic all of its own, too, with these photos of places seemingly frozen in time, often being described as unsettling, or perhaps to some, vaguely familiar, almost as if they were pulled from their memories, but only just the vague and foggy concepts of those spaces. For that reason, many find these photos rather creepy, while others say that they find them either familiar or comforting in a strange sense. There are also those that feel just the opposite, with these photos often making them feel like they are seeing a space that they shouldn't be, and many of them often note that they feel as though looking at these photos, particularly those of empty homes, once full of people, is like that of peering into a place, a part of time in someone's life where they know that they themselves do not belong. So obviously there is a lot of complex feelings and general emotions connected with these photos and this concept of liminal spaces in general. Personally speaking, I have always found these photos oddly relaxing. I know there are those that share my sentiment, and while I cannot speak for them, I can share personally that I find these sort of photos calming because I believe I kind of perceive them as a space of quiet away from others, where normally they might be that of chaotic noise. To illustrate what I mean, I remember back whenever I was in college, I often took the earliest classes, and on top of taking the earliest classes in the morning, I would also end up going there quite early, anywhere from 20 minutes to even close to an hour before the class would start. Now, I did this personally because I kind of just wanted to get classes out of the way as soon as possible during the day. But I also remember that being there so early during those hours, waiting in the hallways outside of classrooms, sometimes before the sun had even fully emerged, was oddly tranquil. It was a moment of silence before I would need to concentrate on whatever assignment or study I would be doing next. And I believe in those moments, being in a place normally filled to the brim with people walking, talking, and often complaining between their classes, I suppose it gave my mind a bit of time to decompress, especially if I listened to music while doing this. And it was only as more people shuffled in and took up more seats in the hallways that I would ever feel just a little bit more tense. Now, perhaps that was just conditioning on my end, knowing that soon the hard work would have to begin, the more people would shuffle in. But nonetheless, I do find the idea of walking around an empty mall, or at least one with nearly no one in it, or perhaps places like an amusement park, or how even just an office building or something of the sort, the kind of itch, that strange part of my brain that enjoys those quiet little moments, those transitionary minutes of frozen silence before constant motion and work would resume. But we're getting a little off topic. Back to the concept of Dreamcore. Dreamcore is what happens when you apply the ideas of liminal spaces, but put them into the world of dreams. Suddenly now, these spaces could be perfectly little colored houses all in a row, too picturesque to really fit into reality. Or perhaps it's an empty street, cascaded in a misty hue of purple, pinks, and yellows. Or maybe it's far more otherworldly and abstract in its ideas, like that of houses set atop perfectly sat, yet asymmetrical hilltops, skies filled with undulating eyes and winged creatures, mushrooms, trees, or nature in general being contorted into ones with their eyes gazing upon you at all times. Dreamcore is essentially these strange sort of places that seem almost like reality, but it's to some degree off. Maybe it's just a little off, or maybe it's very off. These images, under the Dreamcore category, often are paired with cryptic text, and the cryptic message could be anything from something rather ominous or just simply nonsensical. These images and concepts often evoke feelings of anemia, or perhaps comfort, nostalgia, unease, or, again, like liminal spaces, a strange, hazy sense of familiarity. It, of course, depends on image to image as well, as there's also a large portion of Dreamcore's aesthetics that I would call a bit more kitschy, with a lot of edits of these characters with flowers for heads, wings, and giant eyes undulating on their face or their bodies. These have less to do with the liminal space stuff and more so the kind of concepts, I suppose, the mind might try to come up with. In theory, anyway. According to the Aesthetics Wiki, quote, "The exact origins of Dreamcore is unclear, but the earliest known images seen in Dreamcore-related media traces back to 2018 on Tumblr, where user GBRLTVRST shared visuals featuring surreal landscapes and 3D elements. Over time, specifically around the pandemic, the aesthetic saw a significant rise in popularity, with creators such as Lizard Kisses creating comedic little videos that included stitched characters, which would eventually become a common factor in Dreamcore images. The expansion of Dreamcore was also fueled by compilations of TikTok shorts, user expression, and YouTube channels like that of Mother is Watching, unquote. Looking at some of those accounts, like Mother is Watching, reveals a little bit more about the core ideas of what makes up much of the aesthetic's identity beyond just simply the concept of liminal dreams. We see more of the eyeball creatures interacting with each other, as well as a strange sort of sense of humor, an ominous irony to the tone of pretty much anything said. Like in the video, The Food of Mother's World, which shows the food that I suppose this mother feeds her kids, which is supposed to be us, I guess? And it's all sugary and colorful cakes and ice cream, easy-baked cookies, and Kraft mac and cheese and sugary cereal. Basically just a bunch of stuff that you might associate with childhood. There's also the video Mother's World Rules, which showcases the rules of being in Mother's World, which seem to be a strange, dreamlike, and nonsensical number of ominous rules, paired with the Jack Strawber song, Pick a Flower, which I do not believe I can play here for copyright reasons. But in general, Jack Strawber's music is very often associated with this aesthetic, at least in video form, especially over on TikTok. There's also, for sure, an element of what I would call amateurish creepypasta type stuff, at least within this Mother is Watching style of the Dreamcore aesthetic, with the example I would point to being the video What Happens When You Break Mother's Rules, which just shows a bunch of ominous looking images, including at one point just the fucking Eyeless Jack creepypasta image, which makes it a little bit hard to take all too seriously. And some may even say it comes off as a little bit try-hard, almost like a kid or a teenager trying their best to scare people or be mysterious or spooky. No hate though, maybe that was also part of the intention. After all, many of the edits of Dreamcore visuals are done in a kind of choppy fashion, and while it's easy to think that this is due to a lack of skills or photo editing know-how, it does seem to be a very conscious style choice of Dreamcore, with my best guess as to why being that it adds to the oddity of these images. I find it also gives the odd effect of making it look kind of mixed media, be the edit good or not. Like these are all little random photos or pieces of ideas just kind of strewn about, which I suppose is not all that dissimilar to someone trying to describe one of their dreams to you. However, it is nonetheless a bit of a showcase in what is often a criticism of this aesthetic, as the wiki notes. Quote, a part of the criticism around Dreamcore was due to inherent irony centered around the core suffix and the overcategorization of aesthetics at the time. Communities like Flop Talk viewed Dreamcore as cringy or a joke, and other communities believe that Dreamcore and other related aesthetics such as Traumacore and Weirdcore were merely buzzwords, or terms used to validate or romanticize fake or undiagnosed mental health issues. Dreamcore's visuals were also a significant factor of criticism, since many people would call out the repetitive visuals of Dreamcore, such as mushrooms, eyes, OCs, cryptic text, and angels with wings, without any so-called unique change to the aesthetic. The conflicting names of Weirdcore and Dreamcore also led to further criticism of Dreamcore, causing some viewers to yearn for the old a Weirdcore, or to label Dreamcore as a watered-down version of Weirdcore, unquote. By the way, feel free to drink every time I say the word aesthetic or core during this video. Just know that you will be missed when you inevitably die halfway through this video. Now personally, I don't have any problem with the aesthetics of Dreamcore, and I think a lot of these criticisms are people, frankly, being kind of party poopers. But the reason I pointed it out is to showcase that most, if not all, the aesthetics that I'm going to be showcasing in this series and on this wiki, but I guess just in general in life too, are often a direct result of an earlier aesthetic getting popular first, which causes people to then want to add on to it until it eventually becomes its own sort of aesthetic, or core, which, by the way, core is just internet lingo for aesthetic if you didn't know by now. And this is why diving down this rabbit hole of aesthetics leads you into even more of them, which then leads you into more and more niche internet or IRL subcultures and art movements, that then eventually leads you into ultimately more new art, music, films, games, etc. And then it all kind of feeds back into each other. Some aesthetics are a direct descendant of another one, while others are in direct opposition to that one, and others are just entirely their own thing regardless. I should also note that in the aesthetics wiki, they often showcase pieces of media that are connected with this aesthetic, and while some of these pieces of media and art were made during or after this aesthetic's rise and what have you, as a direct result of it existing, there's way more that actually came before there was ever a name given to a said aesthetic. What I'm saying is, quite a few of the aesthetics on this wiki are less organized or even large movements, but instead a sort of categorization of art and concepts that could have all been made in their own little vacuums, but are similar enough to each other, and that simply never had a name for them before, with one of the best examples of this being that of Fruiger Aero, but we'll get to that one in a bit. This is why I figured Dreamcore was a good start for us today, because it introduces the idea of not only liminal spaces, but also that of internet-based aesthetic movements, inspired by other internet core movements, as well as a very specific set of visuals that you could easily look at any image of and say, oh, yeah, that looks pretty Dreamcore to me. I've also been showing several videos from the YouTuber Bathex throughout this whole section, by the way, which I would also say definitely fits into the Dreamcore/Weirdcore aesthetic, even though I'm not really sure if that was their intention or not. This being another example of that. And on that note, I suppose we should briefly talk about the music and art that is associated with Dreamcore, or at least the stuff that I can at least show you here on YouTube without copyright issues. I'll have no doubt been playing some of the music that is associated with Dreamcore throughout this whole section, as I will continue to do with each aesthetic that we cover in the future. But a few standouts that I definitely cannot show but are connected to it are, for example, anything done by Jack Strawber, but notably a lot of the songs that can be found in his shorter animations, like that of T-Errors, Baby Hotline, Hope, Doctor, Peppermint, and Pick a Flower. Some other songs connected to Dreamcore are I'd Rather Sleep by Kiro Kiro Bonito, Never by Maglo, Comfort Chain and 647 by Instupendo, 7 Weeks and 3 Days by Young Ganita, Fallen Down by Toby Fox, which is the Undertale song, and A1 is Just a Burning Memory from the Caretaker album. Also, the Caretaker album, as you might imagine, is deeply connected with not only Dreamcore, but liminal spaces and a lot of this stuff in general. If you're not familiar with the Caretaker album, the short explanation is that it is a 6-hour album that is meant to represent the degradation of one's mind under the Alzheimer's disease. So pretty dark, heavy stuff. But nonetheless, when we're talking about dreams, hazy memories, and places that feel familiar but maybe you've never been to, I'm sure you can kind of make the connection why this album would often be paired with these sort of aesthetics. At any rate, if you're interested in hearing more music connected with this aesthetic, there will be a playlist down in the description below for your viewing pleasure. Now, as for other forms of media, there are several games that are deeply connected with the Dreamcore aesthetic, with one in particular being that of Earthbound on the Super Nintendo. What with its strange, quirky little characters, the picturesque, colorful version of suburbia, yet strange and surreal, hazy atmosphere, mixed with some pretty disturbing and horror elements later on in the game, Earthbound really does fit the Dreamcore aesthetic like a glove. It being called Dreamcore, as you might imagine, also ties it to some games that are associated and connected with dreams, like that of LSD Dream Emulator and Yume Nikki. LSD Dream Emulator is a 1998 game that really is its own rabbit hole worth exploring by itself, but it sees you exploring these abstract and bizarre environments, dreams and nightmares alike, all on the good old PlayStation 1. And while I would say that LSD Dream Emulator can actually be associated with quite a few aesthetics, Dreamcore is a pretty obvious choice. Same goes for the RPG Maker game classic Yume Nikki, which has many aesthetics and ideas all of its own, but again, fits pretty well into the Dreamcore aesthetic as well as the general concept of liminal spaces, with you traversing these surreal dream worlds and nightmares alike, aimlessly wandering from one strange place to the next. Yume Tuki also fits in here quite well, since it actually takes the visions of many people's dreams and nightmares alike and presents them to you, the player, to explore. Contextless, and yet here all the same, to see the innermost visages of other people's minds. On that note, I would also like to add that while Dreamcore, as an aesthetic, is often associated with certain images, again like the mushrooms and the eyeballs on wings and what have you, truth be told, dreams are, limitless. What does a man's dream and visuals look like in comparison to a woman's? A child's compared to an elder? What of one culture to another? Or simply just one person to another, you know? In that sense, I feel like Dreamcore could and should emphasize dreams as a concept in general, which is why, personally, I would say things like LSD Dream Emulator and Yume Tuki fit a lot more of what I would assume Dreamcore would be like. It should also be noted, though, that often whenever you go looking for Dreamcore playlists on YouTube and what have you, or even just animations and videos, they will often be paired and sometimes conflated to be the same thing as Weirdcore, which makes sense since Weirdcore came first, but it's also different and really its own rabbit hole worth exploring. But it's also not one that we're going to be exploring today. Maybe we'll save that for next time. Instead, I think it's time for a little bit of a change of pace, outside of the world of liminal spaces and dreams, and into the sharp, metallic, surreal edges of both sigilism and Metalheart. So, what is cybersigilism? Well, to start, the Aesthetics Wiki notes, quote, "Cyber sigilism is a black work tattoo and visual design aesthetic characterized by intricate, needle-fine line work that fuses biomechanical horror with internet-age mysticism. Originating from the Berlin underground club scene in the late 2010s, the style functions as a maximalist rejection of the clean, minimalism dominant in 2010's design. The aesthetic is predicated on the used future textures of cyberpunk, the dark surrealism of H.R. Geiger, and the illegible, aggressive typography of extreme metal band logos. Although the term is often used interchangeably with neo-tribal, practitioners distinguish it from traditional indigenous tattooing by focusing on futurism and body autonomy / self-expression, unquote. And as you can see, that pretty well describes it. These sharp, aggressive tattoos that look kind of like the stuff that you would see on a metal band t-shirt or album. And they do kind of look like tribal tattoos, but far more edgy. Some may say even slightly grotesque, with their influence coming from H.R. Geiger drawings, which I would personally describe as a mending of flesh, barbed thorns, and other indiscernible matter. And maybe this is just me, but they also kind of give off the vibe of something I might just casually be sketching or doodling in a sketchbook whenever I kind of just want to fill my mind with something as I'm sitting there. But obviously far, far more intricate. The wiki article goes on to note, quote, "Early practitioners of cyber sigilism sought to move away from American traditional styles, instead drawing from the 1990s and early 2000s video game aesthetics and dark web graphics. The movement gained significant momentum during the pandemic years of 2020 to 2022, as creators utilized platforms like TikTok to show designs that mirrored a sense of end times paranoia," unquote. Now, I wanted to show this frankly super cool aesthetic that, while it doesn't have really any music or other related stuff connected to it, it's just simply a tattoo / aesthetic art movement in its purest form, it is also a smaller piece of a far larger chain of aesthetic design. And while we could look at it from quite a few angles, I wanted to hone in particular on that dark web video game aesthetic design influence that the article noted to show you something many of you will no doubt be familiar with if you've lived long enough to see it, but maybe never knew had a name attached to it. That being this. Does any of this seem familiar to you? If so, then you, one way or another, bore witness to the aesthetic artistic movement known as Metalheart, sometimes called deathcore. And according to the wiki, quote, "Metalheart is a futuristic aesthetic that was popular in the late 1990s and early 2000s, succeeding the early cyber and cyberdelia styles of the mid-1990s. It was characterized by deformed, abstract shapes and futuristic UIs on blurry backgrounds. Websites dated back to that period, such as Two Advanced Studios and DeviantArt, influenced the aesthetic, possibly following the success of The Matrix. Metalheart was named after Andreas Lindholm and Anders F. Ronblum's 2001 book of the same title. This aesthetic peaked in popularity in the early 2000s, and later became saturated by the mid-2000s, unquote. Much of this aesthetic can be described as abstract shapes, either 3D or 2D in nature, often creating a sort of strange splashing effect. Sometimes they even look like tentacles or wires, or just more abstract, unearthly shapes, all strung about in a chaotic fashion, in addition to other random elements like photos, text, etc. And this exact sort of design language was found on not just websites, but also very often in the graphic UI of apps, but also in the UI elements of many video games from the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and Xbox era. But it was also very much associated with the Matrix films, and, in particular, the original Xbox UI, the two of those pretty much being the most popular uses of the Metalheart aesthetic. Personally speaking, looking into this aesthetic was pretty bizarre, because it really was in quite a few places back in the day, places that I was very familiar with at that point in time. And yet, I sort of never hear anyone, or have heard anyone bring them up specifically. But even during the time when it was at its most popular, maybe I just wasn't in the right places to see it, but I'm not sure I really remember anyone calling much attention to it at all. Hell, even I sort of feel like I memory wiped it just a little bit, or again, at the very least, never really thought about it being a set aesthetic with a name before now. But looking at it and thinking about it now, not only because it was connected with the original Xbox UI, but also just many video games UI elements at that point in time, I think it's fair to say that it was very much connected to the aesthetics of gamer culture during that period as well, sort of becoming the de facto design language of video games and those who enjoyed them. And looking into it even further, these design elements could also be found in forum banners in gaming forums, but also in old MP3 player skins, and especially back on DeviantArt, which is pretty interesting to think about. Now, some of you might be thinking at first glance that this artistic movement and these images sort of feel like random things spliced together. But to those of you who feel that way, I have a simple question to ask of you. How would you go about making this image? Not imitating it, but full-on replicating it. If you don't really know right off the top of your head, then perhaps you're starting to understand the greater purpose of this particular art style. It was a showcase of skills in the software of the time. Everything from the strange geometric shapes, the effects, tiny text, and the cacophony of noise and visuals that all somehow end up coming together as one singular image, usually resulting in a sick wallpaper or UI HUD. It's a showcase of skills and artistic mastery of the internet art tools of that time period. And even now, they still hold up as something truly unique and stylish looking. An art style and movement you might have gazed upon but never consciously gave much thought to, as it eventually faded away into obscurity, only now having a light cast down upon it again by those who have come to document and wish to appreciate art of all sorts in all of its shapes. Tying it back to cyber sigilism, you might be wondering what the exact connection between it and Metalheart is. Well, again, cyber sigilism has a few influences. Metalheart is connected to it primarily due to the core concept of cyber sigilism, beyond just the aesthetic. It's a combination of technology, that being cyber, and the mystic, that being sigils, and largely represent one's connection to this new digital world, as well as being a form of self-expression, yet also a reflection of the Y2K futurism aesthetic. And, well, as the wiki notes, it could be said that Metalheart is a darker and edgier offshoot of Y2K futurism aesthetic, with a more abstract and mechanical feeling to it, unquote. In the same way that Metalheart is a showcase of mastery over one's skills of the computer technology of the time, so too is cyber sigilism with its micro little details, but also in the blurrier effects that are needed for it to look just right, which again, Metalheart and cyber sigilism both use the blurring of different materials and effects to pull off the exact visage they're going for. It should also be noted that it seems cyber sigilism is also very much connected to, well, as you might imagine, cyberpunk and the cybergoth movement in some ways, which again kind of goes with the name. But more than that, cyber sigilism is also connected with a far newer aesthetic movement known simply as Y3K, which again is a darker, more a boundary-pushing evolution of Y2K futurism, with Y2K futurism being a kind of origin point if you haven't been able to catch on by now for quite a few 90s and early 2000s aesthetics. But once again, is perhaps a far larger rabbit hole for us to explore another day. Maybe next time, because now it's time, once more today, for a change of pace. It's time to move away from the dark, blurry, chaotic visuals of cyber sigilism and Metalheart, and instead flow into an aesthetic that has really made quite a comeback in recent years, and has done so with some rather heavy connotations alongside it too. It is also the aesthetic that would come to, funnily enough, originally supplant the very omnipresent Y2K futurism aesthetic back in the day. For our final aesthetic analysis today, we'll be talking about Fruiger Aero. Fruiger Aero, as described by the Aesthetics Wiki, is, quote, a design aesthetic that was prevalent from roughly 2005 to 2013. It is characterized by its use of skeuomorphism, glossy textures, cloudy skies, nature-oriented imagery, usually tropical fish, water, bubbles, etc., lens flares, auroras, and bokeh, Frutiger fonts, and a color palette of white, green, and blue. The aesthetic's timeline coincides with the early days of Web 2.0 and the transition from feature phones to smartphones, unquote. Something I figured I'd note right away is that of skeuomorphism. Skeuomorphism is a design aesthetic where interface elements, objects, or decorations mimic the appearance, materials, or textures of their real-world counterparts, even when those features no longer serve a practical function. Some examples of this would be the old Instagram logo from way back that looked like an actual camera versus the more flat logo design that we have now. Another example would be UI elements that look like actual buttons or whatever, again, to look like they are the actual object in real life, despite them not really having to look that way because they are simply UI. They could theoretically look like anything. Anyway, the Frutiger article continues with, quote, this aesthetic was originally unnamed at the time. Its visual elements were often associated with specific hardware and software elements depicted in box art and promotional materials, examples being Windows Aero, iOS skeuomorphic icons, and the visuals of Mirror's Edge and Spore, rather than a broader aesthetic. While some referred to the glossy elements as Web 2.0 gloss during its mainstream period, this term described a specific aspect of Fruiger Aero, rather than the aesthetic as a whole. The aesthetic is named after Adrian Frutiger, the Swiss designer who created the Frutiger font family commonly utilized within the aesthetic, and Windows Aero, the translucent user interface theme featured in both Windows Vista and Windows 7. Aero functions as an acronym for authentic, energetic, reflective, and open. The term Fruiger Aero was coined in 2017 by Sophie Zion of the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute and gained widespread recognition in the early 2020s, leading to a significant cultural revival of the style, unquote. And revival indeed it did have. But before we go into the revival stuff, I suppose we should talk about the aesthetic itself and the many examples of stuff that used it. As noted, Fruiger Aero is all about that shine and gloss. Think about those see-through tabs on Windows Vista or 7, contrasted by bright, bold primary colors, and what I would describe as a very light and open visual design, almost as if everything is meant to mimic glass, as well as motifs drawn from nature. Water droplets and bubbles can often be seen, almost as if at times Fruiger Aero is also meant to look a little bit like the aesthetic of a glass shower door, which I suppose one does associate with freshness, cleanliness, and renewal for the day. I would also say an overall goal, design language-wise, was to make the computer, or system, or whatever it was you were using that had this, feel as friendly and inviting as possible. Fruiger Aero is, truth be told, a little difficult to fully wrap into one neat package though, as it represents a lot of different style elements, and there are also subgenres that have since been named under the greater Frutiger family. So I'll note a few of those now. The first, and probably most prominent of these being, Fruiger Eco, which is broadly the mixture of everything we've said thus far, but implementing nature into it. And I think this is probably the most popular of the subtypes of Fruiger Aero, and what I would say most probably associate with it, that being these desktop wallpapers full of futuristic architecture, a focus on renewable energy and living in harmony with nature, often with visuals like lush, beautiful green fields that seem to stretch on forever, often mixed with water or oceans full of vibrant tropical fish, oftentimes bursting out of the computer screen, or giant globes meant to represent the internet, and I suppose the world as a whole. It all probably also symbolizing a sort of clean and idealistic future setting where technology and nature are all in one, and perhaps, in some sense, the ocean being symbolic of the wider web. You know, surfing the web and all that jazz. On the other hand, we then have Dark Aero, which, as you can see, and probably imagine, kind of encompasses that glossy idealized picture, but now as a contrast to sleek black colors. This one was often connected with advanced tech of the time, like the PlayStation 3, the iPhone, or better yet, Alienware PCs. Then there is Technozen, which the wiki describes as, quote, an aesthetic primarily inspired by the aesthetics of the mid to late 2000s Japanese technology. It can be described as cold, sterile, and professional looking, and at the same time, cozy, friendly, and cute. It is the Japanese counterpart of Fruiger Aero, and is described as a sub-aesthetic of it. However, Technozen is largely evocative of Asian design, while Fruiger Aero is more global. Technozen was also popular in the realm of music, with an example being the Wii main menu music. Most of the time, Technozen pictures are collected from the interfaces of the Nintendo DS, 3DS, Wii, and Wii U devices, due to it all sharing their presence, unquote, which is pretty cool in of itself. Also, I just realized I've been calling it Technozen when it's probably pronounced Technozen. It's just it was written as one word, so sorry about that. And oftentimes when you see these Fruiger Aero virtual spaces or videos or animations, they will be a mixture of Fruiger Eco as well as this Technozen design language, kind of blending the two together and thus them becoming associated with one another. But this combination does make sense, again, because they were so very often connect with one another anyway, and they even have very similar values as far as what their core aesthetics and visuals are meant to represent, with Technozen often being connected to mankind being in harmony with nature and technology, as well as general minimalism, health, and the well-being of one's person, with Technozen's music generally embodying a laid-back sort of feeling, often using glossy synths, electric pianos, soft flutes, even having elements of synthwave, city pop, and bossa nova genres of music. There are other design elements as well, like the Frutiger Aurora, which is just simply the notation that a common motif of Fruiger Aero was this aurora, where it's sort of like a natural light display, seen in a high laminated region, and oftentimes were quite colorful. Then there's the Four Colors, which the wiki article notes as, quote, Four Colors was a frequently used color scheme found in consumer products and consumer technology during the mid-2000s to the early 2010s. First primarily seen around 2004 as part of Apple's iPod Silhouette advertising campaign, it is a subgenre of super flat pop and Fruiger Aero, and prominently consists of the colors electric lime, sky blue, hot pink, and neon orange. 4 colors is popular in Japan, with stores and brands such as Daiso, Sony, and Fujifilm. And 4 colors color palette is also noted as being a reference to the colors of different seasons in Japan, specifically pink equaling spring, like the cherry blossoms, green being the summer, orange being autumn, and blue being winter, unquote. That is to say, nothing of the music and media often associated with the art movement, with again, much of it being stuff I've been playing throughout this entire section of the video. Nintendo Wii music in particular being quite a popular choice, with its connection to Technosin. But there are many tracks that are often associated with Fruiger Aero, especially since its comeback. In particular, very often, calming music from video games during that period of time is a popular choice, though I'd say in general, the music that is most often associated with it is a more minimalist, airy, synthetic type soundscapes, usually complemented by hopeful, optimistic beats and tunes, the sort of thing you might hear in an elevator, or again, menu music for video games of the time, maybe for a 3D platformer or something like that. I also tend to notice tracks associated with water or deep sea travel are connected to the aesthetic, like the aquatic ambience from the Donkey Kong Country games. I've also seen quite a few quiet and even slightly melancholy beats from the likes of Animal Crossing, or more upbeat little tunes like the music from the Chao Garden from Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. But there really is so much more. Hell, I find clicking on any video that has Fruiger Aero music as its through line for the playlist or mixtape will of course have some popular picks that most people include, but can actually be quite diverse. Diverse enough in fact that there are specific playlists for specific types of music that is associated with the Fruiger Aero aesthetic. Of course, it goes without saying, but nearly every video game console, smartphone, and computer on the market during this period of time had some variation of Fruiger Aero as its UI design language. And that is significant, because it means if you were alive during this portion of time, Fruiger Aero, whether you liked it or not, was pretty much impossible to miss if you had used nearly any form of technology during that period. And thus, as a result, this design language, artistic movement, very much for a short period of time, is what it meant to gaze upon and visually engage with new technology, until one day, it just vanished. Well, I mean, it didn't just go poof. It was phased out over time in favor of what would become the more modern flat designs that you see even to this day very often. And that's part of what makes Fruiger Aero's revival so interesting. Now there's what they currently call Neo Aero, which the wiki defines as, quote, a contemporary digital aesthetic that romanticizes and deliberately exaggerates the visual language of the original Fruiger Aero design trend. It is a nostalgia-driven movement that gained major traction on social media in the early 2020s, seeking to recapture the original style's mood of technological optimism, environmental consciousness, and polished digital clarity. Unlike the original design, which was initially associated with corporate and user interface designs, Neo Aero is an internet aesthetic applied to digital art, album covers, and meme culture. Its proliferation is often cited as an example of the 20-year nostalgia cycle, as the aesthetic began triggering mass nostalgia approximately 18 years after its emergence, unquote. It is also an artistic movement designed as a sort of contrast to the current internet culture, which, while I am painting with broad strokes here, is fair to say is far more cynical in nature, and thus far less optimistic. Which brings me to a sort of interesting concept that has emerged from this revival of Fruiger Aero. The idea that this was the future that was promised, but was ultimately denied. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, to put it simply, Fruiger Aero was designed during a time when social media was new, and when most people finally had access to the internet easily, and with that came so much optimism about the future, which many note Fruiger Aero's design elements reflecting. It sort of encompassed the idea that good times were ahead, that us all connecting through the web would only bring up more joy, and furthermore, those visuals of technology and advanced society being one with nature, and the world seems sort of like an idealized world, where I suppose people put aside their differences, and man, technology, and nature were all united as one, rather than being at constant odds with one another, which is more accurate to what ultimately ended up happening. Of course, I'm simplifying a bit, but oftentimes when you see music playlists connected with Fruiger Aero, it's always called something like The Future We Were Promised, or Promised Futures. And truth be told, obviously there was no so-called promised future. It was only just aesthetic designs on computers and game consoles after all. But I think that concept took off because, well, frankly, shit can be pretty bad these days. Maybe there's just something refreshing about a look into the past when things seemed so hopeful, or at least the outlook was different than now. What I find especially interesting though is while you might suspect that many of these videos and sentiments would be coming from those who were around to see this artistic movement's rise and fall, waxing nostalgically about an era bygone, as most tend to do eventually. And while this is certainly the case for some of Fruiger Aero's revival, what I found rather interesting is how many young people, kids and teens, and even young adults, who never really grew up with any of this stuff, and were simply discovering all of these design ideas for the first time. It was in them that I found that this idea of the future we were promised came primarily from, not those who grew up with it. Now, this might be shocking to some of you who grew up with all this stuff, but you're kind of fucking old, my dudes. And a whole generation has grown up never having seen any of this shit until just very recently. Or if they were old enough to be alive while it was around, they weren't really conscious enough to ever be engaging with it. And now they have since sort of taken this aesthetic Fruiger Aero for themselves, gone on to reinterpret it and remix it in some rather interesting ways. I suppose it's not that shocking when you consider how just a few years ago, and by that I mean like 10 fucking years ago, or more, everybody was using and enjoying the 80s aesthetic and design language, despite also having never grown up alongside any of that stuff either. And we too also changed and reinterpreted to our liking, notably with the vaporwave art movement, that again is best saved for talking about in detail another time. But it so too also reflected a sense of nostalgia for a time that they had never really grown up in. How surreal is it then for me to find that something I once looked at before without much thought, the UI elements on my Windows 7 laptop or Nintendo Wii, is bringing a sense of nostalgia to a new generation who never even really bore witness to it originally. Now, I've seen some pretty shitty or even angry people and reactions at these kids, or at the very least, being very dismissive of their idea of a promised future as nothing but historical revisionism, or them being a poser, or just simply cringe. And while yes, I'll reiterate, there was technically no quote-unquote promised future or whatever, I suppose I'll also be the first to say that I see nothing wrong with any of this. I don't know what it's like to grow up without any of this stuff, and I don't know what the full perspective of those who are minors or just turning into adults nowadays really fully are. But I do know what it's like to grow up with the internet, but not from day one like it so very often is these days. I know what my experience was, and if looking to the past and trying to make something new of it now inspires them, then I say, let them cook. Art doesn't belong to anyone after all. It is meant to evolve, be remixed, and change with time. And hey, maybe if these simple little nature and optimistic backdrops, and crystal clear inviting windows and concepts of a brighter future makes the younger generation feel kinda sad, or inspired, or nostalgic for something that they never got, maybe that does say something more about the current state of things than most would care to admit. I know of nothing else, I think Fruiger Aero is pretty damn cool, and certainly, personally, makes me feel rather nostalgic. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that it has evolved to what it is now. Because even if they were to theoretically bring it back to all of our computers and tech and what have you, it really wouldn't hit the same now, would it? They sort of sold it as a very specific image that now carries with it, for many, a sense of not just nostalgia, but so too a sense of sadness. So in order for it to continue existing, it can't really remain in its original context bubble anymore. It kind of had to evolve, and I think that's pretty fucking cool. But hey, regardless, I'd love to hear your thoughts, not just on Fruiger Aero, but any of these aesthetics and maybe which ones you'd like to see me cover in the future. What aesthetics inspire you? Do you have any deeper thoughts upon why they might? Let me know, I'd love to hear about them. But with that being said, this has been Aesthetic Analysis.